Unsolved.
JonBenet Ramsey case, The Death of Innocence, a book review. November 5th, 1999, Nashville. Thomas Nelson Publishers announced that it will publish a book by John and Patsy Ramsey, parents of JonBenet. The book, which is scheduled for a March 2000 release, will address many of the myths and falsehoods surrounding this case. Terms of the contract will not be disclosed, although the Ramseys have said the royalties will be used to pay legal fees and other proceeds will go to the JonBenet Ramsey Children's Fund. The foundation was set up by the family to honor JonBenet by helping children in their spiritual growth. So here's a look at the table of contents. And you can see it's almost 400 pages long. And the first 3 chapters are about what everybody wants to know about, at least what I want to know about. And so it's only about 24 pages of the book. And then it continues on with everything that happened after JonBenet's death. And the final chapters, chapter 29, 30, 31, and 32, are about the grand jury and their decision, and if John and Patsy were going to be arrested, and what to do with Burke if they were. Then chapter 33 is about who John thinks might be the murderer. And I call it the If I Did It chapter. The killer probably crept silently up the rear spiral stairs after we had fallen asleep and got into JonBenet's bedroom without waking anyone. Possibly, he silenced her at that time with a stun gun. The ransom note was written on one of the many notepads we had lying around the house. It was written before the killer acted, probably carefully and casually, while we were away at the Whites. John Ramsey points out 7 things. 1, the DNA evidence. 2, the cord and the duct tape. 3, the pubic hair found on JonBenet's blanket. 4, the ransom note. 5, the stun gun. 6, the palm print. And 7, the footprint by JonBenet's body. I'm glad that John Ramsey wrote this chapter, but I would advise him not to do this. It seems disrespectful to JonBenet. It would have been better if they included a chapter about JonBenet's life and the cool things that she did and say a lot of positive things about their daughter. Now there's a little bit of that sprinkled in the book, but nothing that clearly talks about JonBenet for a long length of time. In the book, John mentions this killer out there. There was a killer who must be apprehended before he or she could strike us again. A killer was standing somewhere in the shadows. He keeps bringing up a killer, not like when he's talking about who might have killed JonBenet, but when he talks about a beauty contest, then he brings up a guy in the shadows. To me, the only significant factor that John brings up is the DNA. And so I have a theory about that. It has to do with JonBenet's long johns. They look like a boy's pair of long johns. And so I think they are hand-me-downs, or she got them from somewhere else because she was wetting the bed. So I believe the touch DNA, the skin cells, were all over her long johns, and they transferred to her underwear, and she scraped or touched the long johns and got them under her fingernails. because by this chart here, you can see the combination and the non-combination of her blood. So the JonBenet shirt, tape on her mouth, the white blanket, and nightgown were solely JonBenet's blood, no other unknown foreign DNA. But the underwear and under her fingernails was a combination, and the majority being her DNA with a very minute amount from an unknown male. And so that's what I believe. Near the back of John and Patsy's book has a Chronicle of Cooperation. And so it says Boulder police officers, including detectives, questioned John and Patsy Ramsey throughout the day, December 26th. But that's when they thought it was a kidnapping, because that's what Patsy told them on the phone. Police interviewed and questioned John and Patsy on December 27th. Well, I mean, they had to, because they're trying to figure out who killed JonBenet. And John and Patsy refused to go down to the police station. Police interrogated Burke on December 26 without parent consent. Well, is it cooperation, or do we need your consent? Police were with the Ramseys 24 hours a day from 6 a.m. December 26th through about 2 p.m. Well, statements like that make it seem like they're guilty, because why would they care? And why would they bring up the fact that they were kind of being watched on the 26th? Handwriting samples were given by John, Patsy, and Burke. Well, it is surprising that John handed the police the notepads that morning. And there's a few more on the list, and you can pause the video if you want to read them. But police wanted them to do an interview separately down at police headquarters, because that's the way they do their official business. And so John and Patsy shouldn't be telling them how to conduct their interviews. What I take away from reading John and Patsy's book and knowing about this case is neither one of them are very good parents. I feel sorry for Patsy because JonBenet was a big part of her life, and that put a giant void in her life. But John Ramsey didn't spend much time with the kids at all. I think he had a better relationship with his older children. But on Christmas Day, he went to the airport. And he didn't just go to the airport and come right back after loading the plane. He was away for several hours. So the things that I liked about their book is, it starts off with Christmas 1996. It's a first-hand account by either John or Patsy. It provides real names and places. It's a detailed story after JonBenet's murder, and it does return to the past occasionally. The things that I didn't like about the book were, there's little about JonBenet and any sympathy towards her loss. There's too much from John Ramsey and not enough from Patsy. There's little new information about December 26, the day everybody wants to know about. There's not much positive to say about anybody from John. And it attacks the Boulder Police Department, especially Detective Steve Thomas.
Hey, please consider subscribing to my channel, the Nancy Drew channel, if you haven't done so already. Thank you.
Well, this ends this episode of Unsolved, and next week we'll look at that Access Graphics luncheon and who was there, if I can find that out. And tomorrow night we have the Zodiac Killer case. See you.